You talk in your letter about the perceived lack of leadership, a sense of absence. Why do you think that is?
I think the war on terror created a certain paradigm of fear. If we're too open in what we say, then maybe our organization will get shut down, and the work that we do, how will that continue? The salah, your sujood, is connected to what you see and how you react to what's going on in the world. One of the reasons that the people of Shu'aib alayhi salam were punished is because what they said to Shu'aib wasn't that we don't want to pray. They said, what has the prayer got to do with what's happening in the marketplace? They create these distinct spaces, these secular spaces, and that's why I call it secular religiosity, that we believe that religiosity is something that's ritual, that's something that you can actually see practiced. But actually, the deen itself is so much more encompassing than that. We subsidize Israel's genocide, its constant genocide, its incessant genocide for the last 100 years, by constantly only thinking about rebuilding. Because they bomb a school, they bomb a hospital, they bomb infrastructure. And what we say as the Ummah is that, don't worry, we'll cover the bill. Like, these are small acts. But right now, we're at 0. And what I'm trying to say is that, can we at least go up to 1? So they offer us a ceasefire, and we jump at it because they're like, oh, but this party's talking about a ceasefire, whereas the other party's not. We lose sight of the fact that actually what we should be looking for and calling for constantly and consistently every single day of our lives is an end to a settler colonial apartheid Zionist state. That should be the only demand that Muslims ever make. But I believe that if you were to come before Allah on Yawm al-Qiyamah with Gaza hanging over your head, and that fisherman was to come before Allah with Gaza hanging over his head, I think perhaps, maybe, you would be more culpable for what's happening in Gaza than that fisherman. And if we understand that the Kaaba is not worth the blood of a single Muslim, as the Prophet ﷺ told us, then where does that leave us?
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and a very warm welcome to the Narrative House podcast. I'm your host Adnan Khan, and today we have a very esteemed guest from the advocacy organization Cage International. Now, Dr. Asim Qureshi from Cage International, he recently penned an open letter to the ulama and to leaders about the situation in Palestine. So we thought this would be a good time to actually invite him on and actually delve in deeper into the issues he covered. So Dr. Asim Qureshi, assalamu alaikum and a warm welcome.
Assalamu rahmatullah. Jazakallah khair for having me.
Alhamdulillah, it's good to have you here. So I think probably the best place to start is what led you to pen this letter, and why now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the letter's been percolating for a while. It wasn't just something that came out of the blue. It was a series of interactions that I had with various ulama. I'm very fortunate that in my life that I'm in contact with a number of ulama, quite on a fairly regular basis. I get to benefit from their company, get to benefit from their advice, from bouncing ideas off them. So, I'm very privileged in that sense. But, there was just something that was nagging at me constantly, which is this idea that me as somebody who's an activist, and alhamdulillah, it's been, 22 years with Cage, but, maybe a slightly longer history of activism since, even before then, that I've been trying to hold various states to account, the Zionist state included. And it was always a case of like, oh yeah, Asim, you should do that thing. Go out there and, kind of front these issues. And a lot of these scholars would say, well, we're here to teach the people. And I'm fine with that. Like, I know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me a very certain set of skills and a very certain set of knowledge to use for his sake, inshallah, to help this ummah. I get that. I'm down with it. But I always feel like, as somebody who's raised in the tradition of really, really acknowledging that the ulama are the inheritors of the prophets. This is, how I've been raised. That when I studied my religion, I studied it revering these people as people who not only teach me my religion, but act the religion itself. So with that, I guess I was somewhat taken aback at the lack of scholarly response to Gaza, other than, of course, making dua and encouraging people to give charity, which I think most scholars do, which is great. But there is an occupation in place. and there has been a dispossession for over 100 years. And I was left wondering, is that it? Is that all we're going to hear from you in this time? Do you have anything to say about what solutions might be, or what we should be directing towards the Muslim countries, or what we should be directing towards our own governments? Like, where are the public denouncements? Where are the public letters? Where are the speeches? And I found that lacking.
You talk in your letter about the perceived lack of leadership, a sense of absence. Why do you think that is?
I think the war on terror created a certain paradigm of fear that I've witnessed in my life. So, the entire time I've been doing this work for Cage International, trying to represent those who are being affected by the policies of the war on terror, I have seen not just scholars, but community leaders shrink in their politics away from the glare of the state, because they believe that the glare of the state is quite harsh. And so they minimize themselves out of a desire of self-preservation. And different people have given me different excuses, or different reasons. I shouldn't say excuses, different reasons at different times to say things like, well, if we're too open in what we say, then maybe our organization will get shut down, and the work that we do, how will that continue? And of course, the answer that I always give them is that we are not the protectors of this religion. Allah is the protector of this religion. Like, any of us are replaceable. Any of us. There is nobody that exists on this earth that is not replaceable. The religion does not rise and fall based on our preservation. And that's just a reality of our religion.
Mm-hmm. So I find, Asim, there's a lot of scholars out there who say their role is to teach Islam, teach the religion, separate from fighting for justice. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
I mean, I haven't necessarily heard any scholar advocate in that way. So just to clarify from my own perspective, that they say that it's separate, but what they say is that there are people that are on drugs or drinking alcohol who are engaged in all manner of zina out there, and they're trying to bring a whole population of Muslims who maybe have lost their way towards, at the very minimum, praying salah. And for me, I find that really difficult, because for me, the way I've been raised in this religion has always been to see the deen as a holistic thing. That, you really understand that the salah, your sujood, is connected to what you see and how you react to what's going on in the world. That you look at your situation and you act based on your situation. And I say this in talks that I give to university students all the time. It's often I'll turn to the sisters and I'll say, is the burden that you have with your university education more or less than a fisherman off the coast of Somalia when it comes to the matters of this ummah? Like, I'm not giving you a fatwa here, I'm asking you a question. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I believe that if you were to come before Allah on Yawm al-Qiyamah with Gaza hanging over your head, and that fisherman was to come before Allah with Gaza hanging over his head, I think perhaps, maybe, you would be more culpable for what's happening in Gaza than that fisherman, right? And so we always have to look at the situation we're in. And, when we think about the Qur'an itself, and we should try and derive our ethics from the Qur'an, one of the reasons that the people of Shu'aib alayhi salam were punished is because what they said to Shu'aib wasn't that we don't want to pray. They said, what has the prayer got to do with what's happening in the marketplace? They create these distinct spaces, these secular spaces. And that's why I call it secular religiosity, that we believe that religiosity is something that's ritual, that's something that you can actually see practiced. But actually, the deen itself is so much more encompassing than that. It relates to the everyday, in how we interact with our neighbors, in how we are with the environment, in how we are with the justice issues that we see on this earth. And if we understand that the Kaaba is not worth the blood of a single Muslim, as the Prophet ﷺ told us, then where does that leave us? Where does that leave us in relation to a genocide, where we're seeing tens of thousands of our brothers and sisters being slaughtered, live streamed in front of us?
I've seen many Muslims and even scholars, even khatibs, they've been sharing the UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, her videos. And they're really good. What I was struck by, why are our scholars not taking those positions? Why are they not out there even taking on some of those views? You do touch on this in your letter, but why do you think that is?
Again, I think it's out of fear. And I've seen lots of people sharing the videos of Francesca Albanese, and she's brilliant. Like, Allah preserve her, because she's done such a fantastic job of really, putting forward the case that's required. And this is no slight on her. The question is to our own community, is that why, when we have the Qur'an, when the Qur'an is so clear about what our ethics are in relation to dispossession. So when you have your land taken from you, when you have been kicked out of your homes, what does the Qur'an say? Read Surah Hajj, read Surah Shura, right? These surahs that they tell us precisely what our rights are to recover lost land. Why are we relying solely on figures like Francesca Albanese to advocate on behalf of our issues? We can use international law, sure, and as somebody who's literally trained in international law, I use it all the time. But I also think that at some point we have to be confident about the fact that the Qur'an is the final message to humanity, and that it has something to say about these matters, that it has something to say about the resistance, that it has something to say about jihad, that it has something to say about recovery of lost land. And, I really believe that now is the time to have those conversations.
Asim, you talk in your letter about imagined fear. What are you referring to exactly?
So imagined fear is that fear that we produce when we don't know exactly what might happen on the other side. So we're worried, for example, of a regulatory authority like the Charity Commission cracking down on a charity because the charity has hosted a speaker that maybe the Charity Commission doesn't like, or presented a narrative that maybe the Charity Commission doesn't like. So the Charity Commission, within its instruments, is required to abide by the Human Rights Act, 1998, European Convention on the Human Rights, Universal Declaration on Human Rights, right? All the international instruments that put forward a human rights and international law agenda. So within that framework, at the very least, let's not even talk about the Qur'an, right? All of our charities should be able to say that there is a genocide taking place right now. We're talking about a settler colonial apartheid Zionist state, which under international law, there is a completely inherent legitimate right to self-determination to fight against. Where is the problem for any charity in the UK, any Muslim charity in the UK, to talk about the right of resistance? Let's forget about the Qur'an for a moment. If we can just focus just on this element of international law, because what you can say to the Charity Commission is, we're standing by international law in this issue. Where are you? Where do you stand as the Charity Commission on a settler colonial apartheid state? Because all of these UN instruments, all of these NGOs have labeled it that. But we shrink in fear, and we imagine a response that doesn't actually exist in reality. And that response exists, but only as something that we give an imagination to. Whereas when the Charity Commission does finally write to you because you've put out a statement, let's say you put out a statement saying, Palestinians have the right to resistance under international law to fight settler colonialism and apartheid and so on and so forth and occupation, the Charity Commission writes to you. So what? You say, all right, let's respond. We've really thought this position through. Now we have questions for you. These are our rationale under international law and under human rights instruments for the position that we've taken. Can you please clarify as the Charity Commission what your position is? And the reality is that they can't have a position. Because what are they going to do? Turn around and say, well, we think settler colonialism is okay. If they do, then great. Because that's exactly the kind of conversation we want to have in the public space. And we should be using our platforms in order to force that conversation out. But we don't, because we have this imagined fear of what will happen to our charities. And unfortunately, some of our charities have become fiefdoms. And that in itself is a problem.
Yeah, it's funny because we're living in a time where it's not like Zionists or Israelis are hiding what they're doing. In fact, they've been quite open what they're doing. I mean, the statements out there. The case the South Africans submitted to the ICJ, I think the annexes go into tens of pages of statements which are literally, we are going to empty out Gaza, things like that. So that's quite interesting considering the corpus of evidence out there. And these are statements from officials. And on the other hand, you've got people here worried about what the Charity Commission might say. Yeah. So moving along, Asim, you're quite critical of the easy solution some Muslims have gone towards. So you critique, to give some context, you critique charity giving and just making dua as easy choices. Why do you find this limiting? Why do you find these as limitations?
I mean, I used the word easy choices in the article in the end, but I think I used other words for it, in earlier drafts. I think we have to think about, again, if we go back to the imagined fear, what we worry about in terms of repercussions, right? So is there a repercussion for giving charity? More often than not, no. Because, the charity giving is easy. I actually remember a time where there were brothers who would stand on Edgware Road with buckets and say, give money for the Mujahideen in Bosnia. Yes. Like literally be walking up and down the road with a bucket that would say money for Mujahideen for Bosnia, right? And we've gone from there to a situation where we have to very, very, very carefully think about which charities we give to. Now, there's a structural problem here, right? Which is the proscription of Hamas, which, of course, I acknowledge is not just an imagined fear. That's a very real fear. And I do want to acknowledge that's completely legitimate. Like, we also don't hoist ourselves by our own petard by kind of just randomly giving to organizations that we know will have a criminal backlash. That's by the by. So charity giving is needed, right? And the making of dua is needed as well, because the making of dua is necessary as part of our functions as Muslims. But the thing that I'm critical about is this. We subsidize Israel's genocide, its constant genocide, its incessant genocide for the last 100 years by constantly only thinking about rebuilding. Because they bomb a school, they bomb a hospital, they bomb infrastructure. And what we say as the Ummah is that, don't worry, we'll cover the bill for that destruction, right? We've got you, Gaza or the West Bank. We'll do the rebuilding work every time they blow something up. And there's something that is abusive about that relationship when you really think about it, that they do the bombing, we do the rebuilding. They do the bombing, we do the rebuilding. But here's the problem, that even when we do the rebuilding has to engage with Israel's economy, because that's where the raw materials are going to come from in order to do that rebuilding work. So actually the money of this ummah is ultimately, part of it is going back into Israel anyway. And so what are we doing? The question we have to ask is, what is our purpose? And there was one Tarawi I was at where a very nice brother that I know, like amazing brother who does amazing work, and I really love him and I've got so much time for him. He was fundraising for a charity that wants to educate children in Gaza. Brilliant work, work that we should all support and we should give money to. But the one thing that really troubled me about his pitch was that he said, how do you expect these children to move on with their lives if they don't have an education? And in my head, I was sitting there thinking, brother, how do you expect them to move on with their lives when they live under occupation? That's the elephant in the room, not the fact that they can't get an education. I mean, just by the by, Palestinians are the most educated minority group anywhere in the world, right? Like, so even putting that aside, it's the occupation that is the structural problem every day to their forward mobility, not the fact that they don't have a school to go to, because they're finding ways constantly to educate themselves. And so it's that whole thing about, well, we can't, it's almost like an inferiority complex. Well, we can't do anything about the occupation and we can't do anything about Israel's military might. So what we'll do is we'll just try and make the best of a bad situation. I'm not saying that everybody has the answers, and I'm not saying that brother shouldn't be raising funds for that thing. What I'm saying is that can we at least acknowledge the fact, at least be honest with ourselves and say, brothers, the occupation is the real problem here, and what we're trying to do is maybe just fulfill a small part of the needs of the Palestinian people. But I think if we're not honest with ourselves about what the elephant in the room actually is, we're never going to move forward.
You mentioned in your letter about the Ummah gravitating towards carefully managed non-controversial actions. So you've touched on some of it already. What would you consider more meaningful actions? What could your average Muslim in the UK, for example, be doing beyond the non-controversial actions?
I mean, I think people could be doing all sorts. For a start, I write about it in the letter. There's an organization called Palestine Action that is literally entering into weapons factories and smashing up drones and quadcopters. These quadcopters, I don't know if people know what they do, but they emit a sound of a baby crying so that it lures Palestinian adults out into the open to try and find this baby to rescue it, only to then mow them down. That's how evil these quadcopters are. And you have all of these young people who are joining up to Palestine Action, who are kind of going onto the roofs of the factories, lowering themselves in, smashing up the weapons, because they're stopping the weapons from leaving the UK and going to Israel to kill Palestinians. Right now, as far as I'm concerned, there is no action that is more righteous than this. And quite frankly, I haven't seen it. As far as I'm concerned, I haven't seen a single scholarly response to what Palestine Action is doing. And then when you think about the hierarchy, the order of righteous deeds that the Prophet ﷺ spoke about, he said that the best of deeds, when you see a munkar, when you see an evil, is to change it with your hand. That is the role that they're playing. They have literally done that. And I went to visit one of the brothers who's in prison here in the UK. And then like 2 weeks later, I went with my wife to visit the youngest of the sisters. They're both Muslims who are imprisoned in the UK. Unbelievable people, come from the Muslim brother. He's only been Muslim for a very short while, spent his first Ramadan in prison, just has this unwavering commitment to justice, understood. And as far as he's concerned, like, if I stopped a single screw of a weapon leaving the UK and going to help Israel, then the time that I'm spending in prison is very much worth it. And this young sister who only literally just turned 20, talking to us about how, she had this moment of weakness where she was asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during Ramadan to grant her bail, because that's when we went to visit her in Ramadan. And then she saw that Israel had increased their aggression, increased the genocide, and she started making tawbah to Allah for even contemplating that she wanted bail. This is the kind of character of people that we're talking about here. People who are actually trying to stop, these weapons leaving. And, we don't have joint scholarly statements directed at Keir Starmer calling for just at the very least, calling for an end of arms supply to Israel. We don't have scholarly statements praising Palestine Action's response, asking more people to get involved in direct action. You don't have to smash up the factory, but could you perhaps donate something to this organization? Could you perhaps be one of those who, organizes prison visits? There's this really amazing narration of Aisha radiallahu anha during the ifq, during the period where she was accused of doing something unlawful, where she said that there was a woman from the Ansar who would visit her every single day. And this woman would come, and the only thing that she would do is she would cry with Aisha radiallahu anha every single day. She would just come and she would just cry with her as an act of solidarity, right? So the act of solidarity, and Aisha radiallahu anha, spoke about that being like one of the most precious things to her in that entire period. And even when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala vindicates her, and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu tells her to thank the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she said, I'm not thanking him. He didn't vindicate me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala vindicated me. The one thing she remembers from that time is the woman who came and gave her solidarity. I mean, not that obviously the Prophet ﷺ was against her. What I'm saying is that, these acts of solidarity mean so much. And where are we, even if we're not doing the action ourselves, are we at least in the ranks of people who are supporting those actions in some way? Even if it's just to say, oh Allah, grant them success in their trials, in the legal criminal cases that they're going to have coming up. At least be present outside the courtroom when they're having their hearings. Like, these are small acts. But right now we're at 0. And what I'm trying to say is that, can we at least go up to 1 in a scale of 1 to 100?
Yeah, I found this the most interesting part of your letter, actually, because I wasn't aware of this. And in many ways, it's like it's a small action, but you're disrupting supply lines, which are really important when you're in a high intensity war. I think with Muslims, when it comes to response, what you usually see is either protests or what you see is some sort of online response. I haven't really come across Muslims in the direct action sphere, which isn't something new. It's been around for a long time. But what you largely find is non-Muslims involved in this. Why? I mean, it's interesting. Why is this not considered a viable action amongst Muslims?
I mean, I think quite understandably, it's not considered viable action because there's consequence at the other side of it. You know, look at the young sisters. You know, there's 4 of them, 4 Muslims, who are currently being held at Bronzefield, HMP Bronzefield. They all understand and connect what they've done to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They understand that they have put their own liberty at stake for the sake of the Palestinian people, but in a conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala about what is required of them at this time. And that's why, you know, for me, there is no bravery right now in the UK outside of what these young people have been doing. And alhamdulillah that there are more Muslims getting involved in it. But, you know, we need many more. We need many more. And not necessarily, as I said, to break into the factories themselves, but at least to be part of the infrastructure of the organization. You know, even this Ramadan, I was telling people, you know, even though we fundraise for Cage, you know, make sure that you fundraise for Palestine Action too. You know, make sure you give money to this organization, because maybe a single penny of what you give will be the thing to stop the bullet that won't end up in the head of a Palestinian child. Imagine having the reward of, you know, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for having given that donation. And that's important. That's an important part of all of this, of everything that we do.
I suppose like scholars or even every Jummah, making people aware of this, making a congregation aware. Because I'm sure a lot of Muslims are probably not aware of this, or it just doesn't come up on the radar. Because I think from the set of actions you have with Muslims, usually it's protests, it's usually online activity. But I mean, even what you mentioned in your letter about orbit systems was quite interesting. Because obviously a lot of these companies have global supply lines, which it raises all sorts of other questions of how involved the UK is,
Right.
Considering what's going on. Which also brings me to political participation. We had an election last year, and Gaza was very, very prominent. I mean, we're coming up to 18 months. I think literally next week. I mean, we're shooting this first week of April. Right. Next week's 18 months. You know, where does it really leave us with political participation now? Because we were told if you vote the right party in, looking at the circumstances, you can probably achieve something. And you know, where do you think we stand now with political participation, considering we're 18 months in now? You know, what does it tell us?
I mean, I think I've been very, you know, kind of publicly clear about my own positions in relation to political participation, which is that, you know, ultimately, you know, we don't really have a 2-party system anymore. There's no real difference between Labour or the Tories in terms of economic policy, in terms of any especially not in terms of policies towards Muslims. You know, I did the Thinking Muslim podcast before the election, and I made kind of my positions very, very clear, both in terms of the US election and the UK one, that, you know, ultimately, what are you going to get out of these people? They are so tied to Zionism ideologically that what we're asking for and where they're at are completely different positions. And this is also a problem of our imagination. So there's the imaginary fear that we spoke about, but then we also have a problem in terms of our imagination of a future. So we get stuck at the least concessions that we can possibly take. So they offer us a ceasefire and we jump at it because they're like, oh, but this party's talking about a ceasefire, whereas the other party's not. It's actually a ridiculous position, because we're talking about a situation where you're ultimately saying that you're normalizing a settler colonial apartheid regime. And I always tell people, say it out loud. Say those words out loud and think about how they ring inside your ears and your head as you say them. That right now in existence in this world is a settler colonial apartheid regime. Now, there's a lot of young people who don't know what apartheid is. You know, I was still very young when I watched Denzel Washington play Steve Biko in Cry Freedom, a role he should have won an Oscar for, by the way, right? Um, it was such an eye opener because you really, you know, that movie was so profound. It had a profound impact on my childhood in terms of what justice issues look like. And South Africans will tell you that, yeah, what we went through was bad, but we wouldn't want to go through what the Palestinians are going through. And I have a lot of friends who lived through apartheid South Africa. I've visited South Africa many times, and I think it was terrible. And I don't ever make the comparison myself because I don't think it's right for myself to make that comparison. But I can tell you that South Africans who lived through apartheid look at Palestine and say that that is worse than what we went through. So every time we talk about ceasefire, as if ceasefire is a real thing, that is something that we as Muslims who have the Qur'an as an ethical schema should be focused on, we lose sight of the fact that actually what we should be looking for and calling for constantly and consistently every single day of our lives is an end to a settler colonial apartheid Zionist state. That should be the only demand that Muslims ever make. But yet we get stuck because somebody says to us, but we'll grant you a ceasefire and that will stop the violence. The violence is never ending. Even if the ceasefire happens, they go back to a concentration camp. Ceasefire happens, they go back to zonal living, the zonal system in the West Bank. Ceasefire happens, the settlers are still encroaching every day into the West Bank. So what does the ceasefire get us other than normalizing Zionism? And that is the biggest problem. Yes, we need a ceasefire because we need to protect as many Palestinian lives as possible, but not when it comes at the cost of normalizing those who normalize a settler colonial apartheid state.
And I think it's important also that although we had nearly 2 months ceasefire, really from the Israeli side, they never ceased firing.
Right.
That still continued during that time.
Right.
And we now know it was actually the Israelis who made sure the deal was sabotaged and it didn't go into a second stage anyway.
Of course.
So you can only really have a deal when both parties are prepared to come into the middle.
Right.
When one party isn't, you're not really going to have it. And I'm sure, you know, you're old enough. How many ceasefires we had going back in time? Just really one more question on direct action. You know, what can we do? What can your average Muslim do? What can our scholars do really to help or contribute towards direct action? Because this isn't really something on the Muslim radar usually.
So I think for a start, we need to change our entire discourse around the Zionist state. That's the very, very beginning position in all of our discourse. We have to ensure that from the intellectuals and so-called elite of Muslim society down to our most lowly, you know, kind of child, we all understand and acknowledge and know and have in our policy documents and in our public narratives and have every single space of our lives an acknowledgement that settler colonialism and Zionism should not be permitted to exist on this earth. That should be like the foundational stone. The problem is it's not the foundational stone of all of our action and reaction. And because it's not, it's very difficult then to move off of that. Once you have that established amongst every single group and organization, Muslim organization in the UK, and it's ultimately the international law position and it's the Quranic position as well, right? Once you have that established, then you can move forward. Okay, so right, if that is the status of the Zionist state, what emanates then from that status? Well, what emanates from that status is what every single one of us should be saying as well. And supporting and promoting, which is that the Palestinian people have an inherent right, an international law right, a Quranic right to resist that settler colonial apartheid state in whatever way they deem fit, right? That is on them. And it's not for us to condemn or criticize the way they go about gaining their freedom. We then need to, of course, acknowledge why it is that still to this day, Palestine in the modern world, in contemporary times that we live in, is the one place on earth that Muslim foreign fighters from around the world have not traveled to. They have been to Bosnia, they've been to Afghanistan, they've been to Tajikistan, to Chechnya, to Dagestan. They've been so many places around the world. When the cry of the mustadafin, of the oppressed came, help us, they were there. And so, fine, sometimes it didn't, kind of work out as it should have, but mostly it did, and quite often it did. And these people came home and they became doctors and they became lawyers and they lived perfectly normal lives in the UK. Like, I know so many of my friends that I grew up with went to Afghanistan, went to Bosnia. They're all professionals now, right? So we have a long history, especially from here, from the UK.
Yeah.
Why is Palestine the one place we've never been to? Because, and we talked about supply lines earlier, the real jailers of the Palestinians are not the Israelis, are not the Zionists. It's Egypt and Jordan. So where are our scholars on the status of Egypt and Jordan as these kha'in states, as these betrayer states, these treacherous states? Like, we have to have scholarly guidance about the status of, and I'm not talking about the people, of course. I'm talking about the system and the structure of the states that does not permit their international airports to be opened up to allow for people to come and fly in and head towards the borders, right? And now some people might say, oh, this is a pipe dream. Why are you even thinking about this? Okay, fine. Maybe it is a pipe dream. Maybe. But why are we not talking about it? Why are we not thinking about the role that these states play? What is so important about Egypt right now and about Jordan right now that these are states worthwhile protecting in the middle of a genocide? And, I would say largely it's because a lot of our scholars, they like to visit these countries. A lot of our leaders like to visit these countries. They like to go to Saudi Arabia and perform Umrah and Hajj. They like to go to the UAE, to go to Dubai or Abu Dhabi. They like to go to Egypt and, kind of mill around with, Azhari scholars and whatever else in Jordan and get invited by, Ghazi or whatever his name is. They like doing these things on a regular basis. But at some point, we have to ask ourselves, what is the function of all of this when people are dying en masse? En masse. And that's why there's a lot of frustration, because I think there is a lot that scholars could say if they really wanted to. And that, of course, has risks attached to it. And, there are many of us, who've been activists for a very, very long time who cannot visit certain countries. We cannot perform Hajj or Umrah because of stances that we have taken. And we are okay with that because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us to protect life over the preservation of the Kaaba. But we want to see scholars play that role too.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because for the last 13 years, most of the countries in the Middle East had no problem sending people to Syria, arming the different groups and factions. I read one report once of the number of foreigners that were fighting in Syria. And so this is relatively recent.
Right.
Whilst you're right, when it comes to Palestine, if you look at Jordan, the last thing they'll do is open their border or organize people to go. And I think, for Israel, this will be the worst nightmare.
Right.
Your artificial creation, you have a small population, your army's overstretched now, and the last thing you want is lots of people coming over to come and defend. And I was thinking, even from an international law perspective, considering what Israel's doing, any nation in the region would have a right to arm the Palestinians to defend themselves. They've taken out the infrastructure. How do you defend yourself?
Right.
But what you find was Turkey had no problem arming the rebel groups, but actually arming the Palestinians is a different question altogether. So I thought, because we're not talking the 1990s Bosnia, we're talking relatively recently.
Yeah,
you've had that where people descended on a country, the rulers armed them, supported them, funded them, but you've got a genocide going on, you don't see anything. In fact, our rulers are making sure no one goes to that part of the world. Towards the end of your letter, Asim, you suggest several concrete actions for scholars and the wider Muslim community. You refer to like a global response. Do you want to explain some of them, some of the global responses we can do, collaborate with the wider, broader Ummah?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to have an Ummah approach. Ultimately, the existence of nation states always serves to demobilize us. The creation of ethno-nationalism within the Muslim world is one of the the greatest sins of the 20th century. The creation of these independent Muslim identities that are based on a geographical boundary, I think, is a great sin and a great stain on us as a Muslim people. I think it's one of the things about kind of growing up in the diaspora as a Pakistani, that while there are beautiful parts of Pakistani culture that I really love and the language that I love, I'm not tied to it. And I think it's one of the quaint features of growing up in the UK. I think especially experiencing racism in the UK, from skinheads and whoever, growing up, that it actually encouraged you to think outside of, that ethno-nationalist binary. And, there is something in that. There's something very powerful in that. And when I speak to people all over the Muslim world about what's happening in Gaza, they're ready to go. Like, they're absolutely ready to go and do whatever needs to be done in order to help them. But what inhibits them are these like legal boundaries that exist of states like Jordan and Egypt that they know will not permit them to do what they want to do. Could you imagine, say, for example, Egypt opened Cairo International Airport and said, anybody wants to come in, free to come in. If you know anything about Indonesians or South African Muslims or Malaysian Muslims or Pakistanis or whoever, right? There would be an influx that would be very, very, very hard for anyone to manage, because they would see it as their opportunity to do something righteous in the middle of a genocide. And so the call to scholars really is about, right, really thinking outside of these like very narrow restrictions and constrictions that we have been forced to endure for so long, that we have normalized ourselves. I remember once I did a project for a legal team where I interviewed scholars from around the world about notions of defending Muslims. And I start with a very, very simple question. And I spoke to like almost every different type of sect of scholar you can possibly think of, right, across the Sunni and even Shi'i world. And I would start by saying, okay, you're on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I would change the geographies depending on where they were from. And you see, you're on the Pakistan side, there's an invisible line, that's the border between the two countries in front of you. And right on the other side, there is an Afghan being beaten up by say, for example, an American soldier. And you see him and he's almost being beaten to death. Is it an obligation upon you to step over this invisible line to stop that man from beating the other man? Every single one of the scholars says, yeah, absolutely, you have to step over the line. Why wouldn't you step over the line? It'd be haram for you not to step over the line, right? Mm-hmm. And then you'd be like, okay, all right, let's take it to the next step. And when you start going through it bit by bit by bit, then you see this realization dawn on these scholars' faces that, oh, right, these arbitrary borders are the things that are inhibiting our imagination about what a Qur'anic ethical framework of defending Muslim people is supposed to look like. Then they realize for themselves, and it's interesting to see that realization dawn on them of how inhibited their own tradition is by these fake geographic borders. And so, I do give like specific things that people can do, but really what I'm actually saying is think outside of the boundaries that have been placed on you by legal and geographic structures that are not of our tradition.
So I think we spoke about how in the past Muslims converged on conflict zones. We've got some major militaries around historic Palestine. Mm-hmm. Is it not time they intervened? They have the capabilities. I think anybody would just expect you've got militaries in the region. In fact, some non-Muslims have said that.
Yeah.
You've had rulers who have spoken for Palestine. Where are they? Why have they not intervened militarily? Isn't that what should really be? We shouldn't really need people to converge to defend the people, really. You've got military in the region that should be doing that, who for a long time have said that they represent the Palestinians and their cause.
Yeah. There's a group that used to be in the UK that's unfortunately now a proscribed terrorist organization who would say this to me on a regular basis. I guess I have a slightly different view to them, which is, I do believe that there are possibly and potentially good people in some of these military structures. The problem with the structure that is state-led and state-initiated is that it replicates the logic of the state in many ways. If the state is corrupt, its military often replicates that logic too. And trying to subvert, and you know, all of our countries within the Muslim world are either military structures or mukhabarat structures, right? Or like national security structures. They're all the same. So it's really the military that runs the country, or it's the national security state that runs the country, not the figurehead, whoever that is at any given time that's running the thing. So that's where I have less confidence in that narrative. Like, of course, you know, we have all the resources. Egypt has a really large military force, and it has every duty and responsibility as the country that is closest to Gaza to intervene. Like Imam Malik, when he talks about the fard al-ain that develops once an attack has taken place against the town, that those who are closest to the attack it becomes an individual responsibility on them to intervene. But what if the situation is that the military of that country is the thing that is inhibiting the ability to come to their aid? What is the status of that military then? And that's when I think we have to look at, the scholars have to start classifying that military as being a betraying military, as opposed to one that is a Muslim military, right? That's why I don't talk about Muslim countries. I talk about Muslim majority states, because I don't think these countries are representative of the ethico-religious dimensions of the Qur'an, because they refuse to enact the Qur'an in their daily lives. Yes, the constitution, Egyptian constitution, might say the Qur'an and the Sunnah are the highest forms of law, but that is just confetti. The reality is what we're seeing on the ground, which is that it's meaningless in the daily lives of those who are being tortured in Egyptian prisons, or Gazans who are so close to a massive military might but have no help from it whatsoever, because the Egyptian military are the jailers of the Gazans. They are not their liberators. And so we have to reclassify that military in order for the Ummah to understand what our relationship is to that government and to its military as well.
I suppose we're in a scenario where if there was an intervention in Palestine, it would likely be against the chain of command, rather than just come down the chain of command to go and actually do that. That's the scenario we're in.
Yeah, sure, of course, and I get that, but you know, I've studied kind of systems of control and power for a very, very long time, and unfortunately, it takes a lot to subvert people from taking that, to encourage people to subvert a system and take that kind of action. And if a genocide isn't going to do it, like if you as an Egyptian soldier are scrolling through your feed day by day, like the rest of us have been doing throughout the entire world, and seeing the images of decapitated babies like we were subjected to just yesterday, that brother holding up that baby with its head removed from its body, and you are seeing that, and after a year and a half, you haven't been able to bring yourself to do that kind of action, then Allahu A'lam. And maybe this is where scholarly advice is needed. Maybe they need a bit of gumption coming from somewhere in order to do that. And as we know, as you know, kind of lay people, we do listen to our scholars. We like to listen to our scholars. We like to see our scholars being brave. And it gives us such a kind of an emotional and spiritual uplift when we see that, right? Whenever we see that, even if it's just like a little fatwa. There was a Libyan sheikh the other day who was encouraging the Arab kind of aircrafts to go and take action arbitrarily. Everyone felt, yes, mashallah, subhanallah, somebody said something finally, but he's just one man. Okay. Yes, we need him to do that, and he's done his job now. He's used his religion, he's used his knowledge in order to encourage an action that inshallah could produce about a good effect. But what if we had 100 of those people doing that?
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story. Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy for the Middle East, he actually gave me hope in his Tucker Carlson interview, surprisingly.
Okay, I didn't see this, so I don't know what you're talking about.
I was just thinking about this, like, why the armies are not moving. And so Tucker Carlson interviewed Steve Witkoff, and Steve Witkoff said something really interesting. He actually says in the interview, it's only about 2 weeks old, he said that he's really worried about Egypt and Jordan. And Tucker Carlson was like, these are our closest allies, what are you worried about? And he basically goes, because of what's taking place in Palestine, we're worried the 100 million people of Egypt basically are not happy with their regime and what their inaction.
Right.
And he goes, we're really worried about the Jordanian monarchy.
Yeah.
So Tucker Carlson was taken aback. He thought, these are our most closest allies in the region. We've got a deep relationship and you're worried. And the image Witkoff presented was, we're actually quite worried that the longer this goes on, the longer we don't solve it, we actually could have problems.
I agree with that.
So I was like, okay. So obviously, the genocide's bad. You see it day in, day out. Actually, what you find is in their circle, they're actually quite worried. Because, we're 18 months in. Is Israel more secure? Is Israel more safe? Is Israel more stable? In fact, a lot of their actions are not now based on, we've got an opportunity to achieve what we want. It's actually, they're worried. The population in the region is growing. Their population isn't growing. They've lost the information war. Actually, these are desperate actions from people who don't see the future as bright for themselves.
Right.
And that's actually quite an interesting way to actually look at it. So, obviously we see the images, we see the videos, and it's really tough. They're having to resort to this because they're finding actually every option for the future isn't looking great. So, I want to thank Steve Witkoff actually for giving me
Inshallah, I hope that his prediction comes true and that we do see a big change in these countries. It does have to come to a point where you're witnessing all of this stuff and wondering what will bring about a change, because we've seen a lot already. It's the first time we've experienced a live stream genocide, and that should move us all.
Yeah, even in our Islamic history, a lot of the times the lights come from the darkness. It's come from when you're rock bottom.
Right.
So, a final question, really. Just to give you an opportunity, really, what would be, if there's one message you want to give to our listeners today, people are listening, obviously it's 18 months. Your letter covers quite a lot. It's definitely worth a read, especially the section on direct action. I found that really interesting because just purely it doesn't come up on the Muslim radar. Even when I'm thinking on my response, it's usually online and things like that. But what would be your parting message really to anyone
actually
listening?
on that point, which is to look up the work of Palestine Action to see how you can get involved with their work. Obviously at Cage International, we're doing what we've always set out to do as part of our mission, which is to support their political prisoners in particular, to help challenge the laws and the legislation that is impacting on them, to try and change that legislation to ensure that those who are taking righteous actions like this are not criminalized, that them and their families are supported through this entire process. So really, and finally, I guess, hold your scholars to account. If your scholars and your masjid committees are silent, if they're not making qunut, if they're not pushing the boundaries of what they should be saying, if they're not issuing their own press releases whenever something happens out there in the Muslim world, then you should be asking questions, why not? Why are you not doing that? And actually, what should be happening ultimately is that, questions should be asked as to why they're not fulfilling their objectives as charities. Because part of your objective as a charity is to meet the needs of your community, right? And they would not be doing that if they were not responding to what we see going on in the world.
Awesome. Jazakallah khair for today, for the thought-provoking discussion. I'm sure there's a lot for everyone to really get their teeth into, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair.
Thank you for watching the Narrative House podcast, where we look at the crossroads our Ummah stands at. It is time we write our own narrative, and here at Narrative House, we aim to do just that by delving into the issues that affect the global Ummah. If you enjoyed this conversation and you want to support our work, please see the link below. If you want to join the conversation and discuss ideas, then you can join our Telegram channel. Please like, share and subscribe, because this helps us with the algorithm and it helps us to bring content to you. I'm Adnan, bringing you the narratives that matter.